I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Karen Boykin-Towns, the Vice Chairman of the NAACP National Board of Directors. Karen and I discussed the goals that the NAACP has outlined for the Biden-Harris administration in relation to racial equity, particularly around police accountability and reform. We also briefly discussed the lawsuit accusing Trump and Rudy Giuliani of inciting the U.S. Capitol riot, a lawsuit that was filed by the NAACP and several members of Congress. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Karen Boykin-Towns. Karen Boykin-Towns, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm so excited to talk to you, but, I wish we were having this conversation under different circumstances, but, this is America, and America is going to do what America does. And, I really would love to have a conversation with you about Black joy, right? But, we are in the midst of, the Derek Chauvin trial, which I think has been really traumatic for everyone, watching that if you've been catching it. And then you had, the Black Army officer who was pulled over and pepper sprayed. And just now, a couple of days ago, Daunte Wright, 20-year-old young man, father, was killed by the police, just miles from, the incident with George Floyd, right? Mm-hmm. And I know that the NAACP has outlined some recommendations in this regard for the Biden administration. Have these recent events changed the scope, changed the urgency? How are you looking at that?
Wow. Well, Jen, I would just say that, I too wish we were able to talk about something else, but it seems as though for the last, intensely for the last year, there's not much else to talk about. And even before then, right? Because we continue to be plagued by what seems to be an ever increasing attack on Black bodies. And yes, before the administration took place, we, the NAACP and other organizations had meetings and conversations with the president, the vice president, and members of the administration. But where we find ourselves now is, we're in a state of emergency. And I mean, you don't want to sound like you're being, an alarmist or anything, but hell, I think we've been in a state of emergency. And in light of what just happened with the young man, Daunte Wright, and the protests that we've seen the last couple of nights, it really, for me, means that we have to be even more intentional about the policy changes that must happen. Yes, the killings have to stop. The killings have to stop. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, it's about the policies, right? Because people have to be held accountable. Officers have to be held accountable. And the accountability factor has been something that has been missing forever. We will see what happens with the Derek Chauvin case. But at the end of the day, we must get legislation. We must get judges, federal judges and state judges that aren't always just prosecutors, but that are civil rights lawyers and other diverse backgrounds. But I know that for many, it's just like, talking to the wind in some cases, because it doesn't seem like it meets the moment.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting that you said that, because the other night, I was up late, like I often am, and I was reading the news and I saw the headlines come in very early on with Daunte Wright. And I was watching the Chauvin trial, all day. And then at night, seeing these headlines come in about Daunte Wright, I was just kind of at a loss for words. Yeah. And I posted on social media the only thing I could think of to say, which was, this is a national emergency. That's the only thing I could think of to say. And that post really resonated with people, because I think people said, yes, this is an emergency. And one of the saddest things I saw was some parents posting like, my child is afraid. Someone posted they had like a 13 or 14-year-old child who was afraid to take out the garbage. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is where we are. And, I think you're absolutely right about accountability, because that's a big piece of it. And I want to talk about the George Floyd Policing Act, because built into that is a lot of line items for accountability. But when I think about accountability, for me, that's after the fact. For instance, there's one thing about, data collection about, police violence. That's one point. And another one is, ending qualified immunity. But
Yes.
when you get to that point, people have already died.
Yes. Yeah. So I want, because I was shocked at this number, Jen, but believe it or not, the summer, it's not like the summer was, a long, long time ago, but since the killing of George Floyd, there have been 100 unarmed people killed or brutalized by the police around the country. Now, we don't know all 100 of their names, right? Because it's those that sort of pierce our culture that really gets caught on by the news. But there's been 100, right? And so, in my mind, this trial that is going on is a reminder of the urgent need to pass legislation to hold police accountable, change the culture of law enforcement, and try and build trust between law enforcement and our communities by preventing police brutality and allowing survivors and their families to access justice. Now, yes, the act would have happened, right? People would have been killed if you're talking about data collection and that sort of thing. But what I would hope is one of two things. One, we know that these officers move from place to place, right? So maybe the first occasion they haven't killed someone, but they have, engaged in, excessive force that has been recorded several times, and then they leave one police force and they go up the road and they get hired. Well, having a database that would allow there to be transparency so that they can't be hired, maybe that's one of the things that can keep this person from being in with the badge in our communities and be involved in one of these tragic incidents, right? Ending qualified immunity where they can be tried, where if you are engaged in these sorts of practices, not only will you go to jail, but your pension, those sorts of things, for which now is not the case. And if we're honest about it, if you're a police officer and if this happens to you, you don't even see a lot of your peers who have gone to jail, right? So in my mind, being accountable means that, you will suffer a huge cost that right now, they are not seeing happening. And we have to talk about, what are we asking police to do? We need to reimagine these police operations and really kind of determine, do we need them, doing, domestic violence work? Do we need them, do you need a gun doing, traffic stops? How do we look at these budgets and determine whether or not the things that they're being asked to do is what we really need them to do versus having others that may be more qualified in these roles?
No, you're absolutely right. And you're reading my mind, because I've been thinking about that a lot, and about, how we are using the police. And I think
Yes.
that we need to have, a long, intelligent, good faith debate
Yes.
about how they're being employed, right?
Yes.
Or used, right?
Yes.
Because, there's this whole conversation around, abolish the police, right? And I think, for me, I think that's a bit reductive personally, right? Because that isn't necessarily what we're talking about. And I don't want to have a position on that until we have, all of the data and all of the studies and all of the conversations around, like, how do we use the police,
Yes.
But one of the things I will say is that I was looking at the data from other countries who
Yes.
have very few, deaths at the hands of the
Yes.
police, and they all have police forces. They didn't have to abolish their police. They just use them in better ways, right?
Yes.
And I, wonder if we can learn from that. So you don't need to necessarily get rid of them. We just need to be smarter, and we need a completely different paradigm shift. That's just my opinion.
Jenna, I agree. And there are people unlike you and I whose life's work is in this space, and they have done research. They've visited countries that have been able to do this well, and I just don't believe that we've allowed them to have the space and or the platform to talk about what it could look like, right? Because we're so steeped into what we've done, what we know. But if there's anything that has come to pass from the reckoning of 2020, is that everything needs to be on the table. There are no sacred cows, And the police force, how we do policing, is one that we have to have a national conversation about how to have it work in the best interest of communities of color, because by all measures, it is not working. I don't know about you, but I know that if I have a situation, I want to be able to pick up the phone and call the police because they are supposed to protect and serve. But in the environment that we're in, I would be very hesitant because you don't know what could jump off by a call for help. And that is, I think, is the crying shame of this whole thing because, we as Black and brown people, you're afraid because you just don't know what the outcome can be. And I'm sure no one expects to become a hashtag, right? You just don't expect, you don't wake up one day believing that this could be the day when have one of these incidents. But the fact of the matter is, it very well could happen.
Yeah, it very well could happen. And that's the conundrum of, living in the lives that we live, in these Black and brown bodies. And you and I were talking about a bit about living in Seattle, where I live, offline, about how it's not a very Black city, right? The demographics, there aren't many Black people here. And, I agree with you. My house has been broken into and I needed to call the police, right? And that was very helpful to me, but it could have very well gone the other way because there aren't, it doesn't matter whether there are lots of Black people here, but I could very well see, police coming out and not realizing that this is my house.
Right. Or questioning you about it, right? Like, instead of getting to what the purpose of what you've called them for, questioning you, like, you have no right to be there. We've seen that happen around the country. I mean, but ultimately, this is not a time for us to give into fear or despair or, just woe is me, we can't make change. We know that when we have a saying in the NAACP, when we fight, we win. And we are best positioned than ever before to continue to make change. And, you have to be a bit of an optimist to kind of continue to do this work, because ultimately it's for our humanity, and we have to find ways to use our voice collectively as well as individually to push. And it's not just at the national level, it is, community by community, because ultimately elections have consequences. And if we are involved in the sheriff's race, right, and voting for who the next sheriff is going to be, or the district attorney, or the mayor, or the attorney general, all of these positions, they matter. Our city councils, and it's just important that we just not let up off the gas, quite frankly, because our lives depend on it.
Yeah, speaking of elections, I know that the NAACP has a lawsuit, a civil suit, I believe, along with 10 members of Congress, accusing the former president and Rudy Giuliani of conspiring to incite the January 6th insurrection, or the riot. Is that right? Do I have all those details right? And
Yeah.
I know you can't talk about pending legal matters, right? But I just want to clarify, it is a civil suit, first of all. And what does something like this? What would that accomplish, do you think?
Thinking back over the last 4 years, too many people remained silent, right? Not definitely not Auntie Max and many others, but people who were in positions that could have, tried to do a better job at checking the former president. But at the end of the day, I think what we saw on January 6th was something that we could not have written, or imagined. And I can just remember, being home, because that's pretty much where we are, right? And watching this and thinking, this is happening in America. Oh my goodness. And I think that this lawsuit is one where it's just like, he has to be held accountable. And, that's part of what the courts are for. And, we will see what the outcome is. But, just like those 147 Republicans who voted against certifying the elections, they need to be held accountable. And in certain ways they are. But ultimately, we've turned the page. We have a new administration. I think it's like day 82, 83. Definitely we see a difference. But at the end of the day, we also know that, and they know that we must also keep them accountable, right? We have to sort of ensure that racial equity across this government is kept front and center. But we just all must remain engaged at every level that we possibly can, individually and collectively, because when we're united, we definitely have power, and people are listening. People are listening, and more importantly, I think we are pushing people to also take action.
Yeah, one thing about this country is that it never fails to, lose its ability to shock us.
Yes. Um, uh,
And like you, when I was watching on January 6th, I thought, there's no way that
no way.
he can get away with this. There's no way that people are going
Right.
to walk away from
Right.
this. But here we are.
Here we are. Here we
We
are.
had the impeachment trial. The Senate did not vote for that. And so now I think you've answered my question. I'm kind of answering my own question. It is necessary to, continue to try to hold him accountable and
Yes.
them accountable, the people who are behind that, because what does it say if we don't? If we don't even, even pursue it,
Right.
it kind of normalize that kind of behavior. And we can't do that. We cannot afford to normalize what happened on January 6th.
We normalize so many other things that whoever thought would become normalized. But the attack on our democracy, an attack on our democracy, that which is the holy grail of what this country is supposed to be about. I mean, it's just unbelievable. If we aren't going to hold that sacrosanct, then what is, right? And so I believe it's all connected. It's all connected, and it's just it's just critical that we remain focused. We not get overwhelmed, and when we feel ourselves getting overwhelmed, that we do self care, or we do those things that will sort of kind of help us. Like for me, I've had to reduce my level of news intake, and this is like from the TV. So I'm reading constantly, but I limit the times of the day when I am actually tuned into the news, because it is a lot. And I don't really believe that it's good for your mental health to have it on all day. And that's kind of how I was living for quite some time. And I think it begins to take its toll. And it's just important that we, keep ourselves focused on what needs to be get done, and not be distracted, because sometimes it just seems like, where is the progress? But all you have to do is look, right? The elections show just wins that are, really going to make a difference, but for which many didn't think. And if we would not have kind of pushed ourselves and come together, we would not have a majority in the Senate. We would not have, the election results that we did, that we were able to achieve. But, it's not easy though.
Yeah, I actually had to do the same, and I just want to, everyone who's listening, just to take that advice and to take care of yourself. I had to, turn off social media for, a long weekend. I think it was last weekend, after the first week of the Chauvin trial. It's a lot, and we feel that. And you wouldn't be human if that did not get to you, right? And you can't fight, and you can't have these big fights like the ones that we're facing right now if you don't have energy and if you aren't taking care of yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. I just want to add that we stand on the shoulders of people who sacrifice so much to get us where we are, and to think that we are having to fight, the issues that they many times died for. Just is mind boggling, right? That here it is, we're in 2021, and we're having to deal with the right to vote, still. But as we fight forward, as we push forward, it must be with strategic thinking and planning and organizing and policy making and accountability, just to ensure that we are a priority everywhere. And it's all of those things together, and it's all of us working together and finding, ways to do it. And I am really encouraged by just how within the civil rights, social justice space, how, there is more sharing and more um, collaboration, because as President Johnson likes to say, civil rights is not a competition, right? We're all trying to achieve the same goals, right? There might be different tactics, but at the end of the day, we are looking to achieve the same thing, and it's really about how do we use our limited resources in which to kind of do that, and not, where we can replicate, duplicate, and those sorts of things. And so it's an amazing time to be alive, and it's incredible to see the people who are standing up and really in the forefront. And it's all types, and it's just so beautiful to see, because we need it all. Frankly, we need it all.
Well, Karen Boykin-Towns, thank you so much for joining me. I enjoyed having this conversation. And of course, I would love to have you back so we can, hopefully talk about, some of the wins, over 2021 and a bit of joy. So thank you so much for everything you've done. And thank you for this conversation.
Jen, thank you so much for having me, and all the best to you. Stay safe.
You too.